It's a rich and powerful reading when we hear the Passion Gospel read as a Passion play, which is quite an ancient practice really in the church. Not to take away from the depth of that particular passage, I have been thinking a bit about a place in Sydney, of all places, called King's Cross. Now, you've all heard of King's Cross, and I'm sure you're probably wondering why a minister in the church is thinking about such things like King's Cross. It sounds a little bit scandalous, really. But I wonder if you've actually ever been there, because we sort of hear about it on the news, or it's certainly been in the media or the public consciousness, that King's Cross is a place of scandal and a place where you don't want to find yourself maybe at night. The question might actually be, when were you last in King's Cross, actually? Because the King's Cross of 2026 looks very different to the King's Cross of the 70s, 80s, and even really the 90s. I was actually in King's Cross recently because a friend of mine lives in Surrey Hills. So we had met in the King's Cross, Potts Point area, and we were going for lunch. Now, the cross, as it's known, it's a colloquial term for King's Cross, is the cross, which I always find just beautiful, really, the cross. It's been a place of scandal in its day, but these days I would suggest that it has become a bit what is known as gentrified. And gentrified means that probably none of us could afford an apartment in King's Cross these days. It is a place that's very expensive to live, and certainly has a new group of people have moved into it and has made it very, very expensive. Now, don't get me wrong, this place in Sydney still has disadvantage. It still has remnants of that bit of seedy underbelly that it used to have in the 80s. But really these days it's a quiet inner city district, actually. It's not actually a suburb. You know, you can't actually go to the suburb of King's Cross. It's a district. It's an area. It's really more Potts Point and Darlinghurst. They're actually kind of where they join. The cross in Sydney and the cross in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago have something in common. They're both sites of paradox, of things that don't make sense, but are both true together and exist together. So in Sydney, you've got this place called King's Cross, where now wealth and status certainly exist alongside the eccentric, and also homelessness and long-term disadvantage. So you've got both existing together. The cross of 2,000 years ago, death exists alongside life. And actually in the hymn, when I survey the wondrous cross, which is just a beautiful hymn, there's a phrase in there that says, where love and sorrow flow mingled down. Love and sorrow, both of them are true at the same time. It's a beautiful line, and it is one of paradox, that two things are true together. The cross of Jesus becomes a throne of a king, actually. We hear Pilate talking about that with Jesus. But Jesus does say he is a king, but it's not a kingship of this world, because as we see, the cross itself is a very unusual throne for this world. It is a kingdom that is not of this world. Now, because both crosses in my sermon today, the King's Cross and the 2,000-year-old King's Cross, are both sites of paradox, we're actually invited to prepare to be surprised, which is one of my favourite sayings, prepare to be surprised, which in itself is a paradox. Because how can you prepare yourself to be surprised? A surprise is by nature a surprise, but we prepare ourselves to be surprised this Good Friday. Now, I was surprised by King's Cross, the place, that greeted me the other week, and likewise this other King's Cross, Jesus' cross, we are surprised when we hear about this guy called Pontius Pilate. And if you've been coming to church for any length of time, we say the Nicene Creed every week, and we remember Pontius Pilate because we talk about Jesus Christ, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This Pontius Pilate is an interesting character. For many years, we weren't even sure he was a real person. They weren't really 100% sure. Now, they had the scriptures as evidence, which is fair, but there wasn't any historical evidence that exists outside of scripture. So there was a bit like, we're not really sure. He may have been the Roman governor of that time, but again, prepare to be surprised that the Bible had it right the whole time, because in 1961, archaeologists discovered what is called the Pilate Stone that actually records Pontius Pilate as prefect of Judea. So he was a real person, he existed in real time, and with a real person called Jesus Christ. It was a beautiful moment. 1961, in the grand scheme of the history of the world, that's pretty recent, especially in ancient history. That's very, very recent. So the Bible was right the whole time. Imagine my shock. I wasn't shocked, but a lot of people are. So Pontius Pilate is going to invite us this Good Friday to be surprised, because he is actually the world's first evangelist. The world's first evangelist. Now, maybe not on purpose, but he is the world's first. Evangelist just means someone who tells other people about Jesus, who tells the good news. So we heard in our Passion Play this morning that Pilate has an inscription placed over Jesus on the top of the cross that reads, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." And it's written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And those were the 3 languages that were spoken and understood in that region at that time. So they were the popular ones. If you go, Australia's not a multilingual country in many ways, but many countries are, and often many languages are spoken. It was a bit like that in this time and place. And the Jews say to him, don't write that, write instead, this man said, "I was the king of the Jews," which is like a charge against him. And Pilate says, "Quod scripsi scripsi," which is my first Latin for today. It means, what I have written, quod scripsi scripsi. The reason I quote it in Latin is because there was a translation of the Bible many years ago called the Vulgate, and it actually links that particular phrase to Psalm 56 and 57. So you've got Pilate, who's not Jewish, who's not a fan of God, not a follower, quoting in some way Psalm 57 and 56. And you go, something going on here. I'm prepared to be surprised that Pilate might actually have a role in spreading the good news. The Bible is an overarching and connected story. It all links together. Just have to look kind of below the surface and intertwined. It's there. Now, we can understand that Pilate's action here was probably meant to mock. It's meant to be a bit funny or a bit, subversive. But I would say he's actually mocking the crowd. So I don't think he's mocking Jesus. I think he's mocking the crowds that are deriding Jesus rather than Jesus himself. Because if you hear the Passion Play and read the Gospel, Pilate's pretty reluctant to have Jesus crucified. I'd find no evil against him. What has he done? He's trying, and it's the case that what Pilate writes is quod scripsi scripsi becomes a paradox. What was meant to, it's also a mocking, but it's also an evangelistic action. So everyone walking past that cross, because that's what they would have done in those days, your execution under Roman rule was very public and very humiliating and very, it really degraded the person on the cross. So they would have not only had that, but also this title above Jesus, and people would have read it and said, "The King of the Jews." That's a messianic title. I heard that at the synagogue the other day. That's what they were talking about when the Messiah would come. That's what he'd be called. So people are going, hang on, so the Messiah's on a cross? That doesn't make any sense. He's dying for us. That doesn't make any sense. It becomes a king's cross. It becomes a site of paradox. So Pilate has become the first person to say who Jesus really was, outside of Jesus himself. Isn't that remarkable? Prepare to be surprised that Pilate would be the first evangelist. I think it tells you something about the God we follow. This king's cross tells us that no matter who you are, even if you are Pontius Pilate, you are able to tell people about Jesus. Even if you are Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate was no saint, okay? Like, he wasn't someone that we might venerate as a saint, although in some churches they do. But he was a sinner, like the rest of us. Just a person probably just trying to do his job, actually, and trying to make people happy and placate everybody, and it's a tough gig. But he was a sinner, like all of us. The only person that never sinned in the world was Jesus Christ. And Good Friday does draw our attention to our sin. It does, because this is the day that the dysfunction of humanity is on show, that God himself would be crucified. There's a saying, I think it's from Friedrich Nietzsche, that says, God came and we crucified him, we killed him. And you go, that is a really indicting statement against the human race, that God came and we killed him. But it shows us, though, if we look at Pilate and we're prepared to be surprised, that sin is actually not the end. That's not the end of the story. That our human limits are no match for that king's cross. It's no match for them. Because wherever paradox exists, when you go, there are two things true right now, and they are opposite, but they're both true, you can say to yourself, God's here in some way. That's how you know he's there, because God himself is paradox. God is human and God at the same time in Jesus Christ. God is closer to us than we could imagine and beyond our comprehension at the same time. Both of those things are true. So whenever you see paradox in your life, you go, God's here in some way. I feel happy and sad. God is here. We are paradoxes as humans, sinners and saints at the same time, sinful and redeemed at the same time. King's Cross in Sydney is a living paradox, even today. And this King's Cross from 2,000 years ago is also a paradox. It means that God is present. God is present at the cross in a way that we cannot get our heads around. But he is present. So thinking about God being present even in the physical place in Sydney of King's Cross is pretty wild. And it's also a metaphor for God being present in our sinfulness. Because if God is present in King's Cross, God will be present to all of us. I think thinking about God being present in the Sydney King's Cross is really the story of this same King's Cross. The sinfulness of humans, which is what the cross originally represented, becomes the King's throne. It is unexpected. Friends, Good Friday invites us to expect the unexpected, to prepare to be surprised. No one expected me to talk about King's Cross, the place, today, I am sure. So I hope you were surprised, and I hope you were prepared to be surprised. I wasn't even expecting it. Sometimes I ask God, what do you want me to talk about today? And he's like, King's Cross. And I go, oh, that's got a dual meaning. Okay, sounds good. No one expected a Roman governor, the enemy of Israel 2,000 years ago, to be the first evangelist. No one expects that. No one expects that a Roman execution device, which is what the cross is, to be the throne of a king, to be a king's cross. So perhaps the next time you find yourself in a King's Cross area in your life, you know, a place that feels messy or complex or even a bit scandalous, you might remember this King's Cross. And remember, it's a place where opposites meet, a place where what at first looks like death actually becomes life, and a place where even in the mess of humanity, God is truly present. Amen.